let's say, under the liberal paradigm. Remember, we say all nation states operate around three main interests: security, economy, and the protection of core values. So for every state, from the least powerful to the most powerful, the main the main self-interests revolve around, first and foremost, of course, survival, which we define as security. Second, the economic well-being. And third, and this is not an exact rank ordering, but third, the protection of core values. Now, different paradigms place different emphasis on the relative emphasis of which aspect of these national self-interest matters the most. For the realists, we know it's a security. Now, one of the key challenges that we see coming from the liberal paradigm is the emphasis of economic concerns and economic interests as playing an important role, as important as security interests. For the realists, economy matters for its impact and its input onto the country's military capabilities. So economic power, economic capabilities would play an important role only to the extent to which they contribute to a country's ability to build up military capabilities. In and of itself, the realists don't see economic interests as, as critical on their own. Okay, this is challenged, of course, by the liberals on a number of platforms. Now, one of the things that, again, you need to keep in mind is the realists and the liberals share a common assumption. What is their common assumption? We've been talking about their different assumptions, but they also have a common assumption. What is the common assumption between the liberals and the realists? Yeah, that's a common assumption. What was the second common assumption? So anarchy is a common assumption. The world is defined as one of anarchy is a common assumption. What would be a second common assumption? The starting point for both. So anarchy, yes, Batuhan is 100% right. The rationality assumption, okay? Both are rationalist. The only difference that you have in liberalism is they also talk about the fact that rationality is bounded by the available information that states have at their disposal. Now, rationality assumption takes us to the fact that both realists and liberals see the world around an utilitarian calculation or from a utility-based perspective, specifically with respect to states' actions. So under the liberal paradigm, the economic impact of interstate relations emerge as an important variable shaping state behavior as important as security concerns. So we actually see in the 70s, in the 1970s, an offshoot, let's say, under IR theory, which looks into the international political economic dynamics. Let me give you a brief background. Okay? Now, when you think of post-World War II international politics, now the 40s, 50s, 60s, theoretically, from 1945 to, let's say, 1971, 72, we see the dominance of which paradigm? Realism. We see the dominance of realism paradigm with its emphasis on security concerns, with its emphasis on the rational actor model, with its emphasis on state-centric and how states matter, of course, within an anarchical world. Now, within that framework, we also see the relative importance, relative unimportance of domestic factors, as we have discussed before. But in 1971, 72, things began to change. What do you think would impact international politics in the 70s tremendously? What do you think happens in the 70s, empirically? Okay, so Batuhan says 1973, the OPEC crisis. Okay, in the last Arab-Israeli war in 1973, when it becomes obvious that the Arabs are losing vis-a-vis the Israelis again, most of the Arab countries who also happen to be oil producing and oil exporting countries have formed OPEC, oil producing and exporting countries, and they decide to basically restrict the supply of oil, and it's classical economics. If you restrict the supply of a product which cannot be substitutable, the price shoots up. Okay? So the oil crisis is one of the important developments that impacts international politics in the 70s. Prior to the OPEC crisis, we actually see something else is happening. In 1971, one of the core elements of the international order in the post-World War II period, Bretton Woods system begins to crack. Okay? We talked about Bretton Woods here before, if you remember. In 1944, 44 countries came together in New Hampshire, in the United States, under the American leadership. And one of the things they discussed was that the path to World War II was opened through the extremely volatile and unstable international financial system, specifically with the competitive devaluations that European countries used in order to increase their own competitiveness. So the Bretton Woods Conference led to what? Do you remember? What was decided in the Bretton Woods Conference? Okay, what was decided in the Bretton Woods Conference, as Alican have said, is the fixed exchange rate system, and the American dollar was fixed to the gold. This is critical, okay? This is critical in international politics, and when you go out on interviews in the Turkish Foreign Ministry, when you go for interviews in the World Bank, the IMF, the private sector, Unilever, what have you, they will ask you about Bretton Woods. Okay? Because Bretton Woods is the critical pillar of the international financial system right now as well. Okay? And it's created at the end of World War II in 1944 to prevent international financial uncertainty. Okay? And the prevention of the international financial uncertainty passed through the American financial strength. Okay? We now have an ongoing financial crisis, as some of you might be following, and that also is important under the Bretton Woods order as well. So Bretton Woods, okay, changes the international financial order to a Pax Americana. It places the American dollar as the central currency, which it still is, and which is now challenged by who? Is there a challenge to the American dollar these days? By China, exactly, okay? And a lot of, newly emerging powers, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, are challenging the Bretton Woods system and the American dominance there. So the American dollar is fixed to the gold, and on top of that, the institutions which shape the international financial system, the IMF and the World Bank, are created. So today's main institutions, you can think of this today's international economic governance, okay? Today's international financial governance. It passes through the end of World War II. And the Bretton Woods is one of the main pillars of that. You can actually say there are two main pillars of the international economic order. One is the Bretton Woods system, and the second is the GATT system, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. Okay, so you have two twin pillars. Okay, these twin pillars, international economic system, are created at the end of World War II for a very specific reason. Okay, they were created in order to have a system of economic governance within which states would not be as free as they were before World War II to manipulate the international economic order, so that it would prevent another all-out European war. So Bretton Woods is about international financial stability, because the diagnosis was made during World War II that international financial instability acts as a cause of war. Okay? It's one of the paths, one of the inputs into World War II. So what do you do if you want to prevent another war? You would create an international system that would eliminate the causes of uncertainty into the international financial system, and you place the most powerful financial government or the most powerful currency at the very core, which happens to be in 1944, the American dollar. Now, what makes currencies powerful? Classical macroeconomics. All of you are taking macro, micro, what have you. So what makes a currency powerful? What are the causes of, when you think of the Turkish lira today, okay, another currency? What shapes the strength of the Turkish lira? Well, you can say it's in a much more simpler fashion, the general health of the country's economy, okay, and its trade flows. Okay? So the countries that have the highest amount of exports in comparison to their imports would always have a higher demand for their currency. Countries that have very healthy macroeconomic structures. Interest rates, as Batuhan said, is one. Public debt is another one. Okay? That's part of the reason why the euro has been falling in the past couple of years, because there is a variation within the Eurozone countries with respect to their public debt. On the one hand, you have countries like Finland, which don't have a high public debt, versus Greece. So general macroeconomic health. But if you remember some of the things I have told you before, at any given period of time, you could also assess the country's preponderance power through the economic relations. So in the 19th century, we claim the 19th century to be an era where United Kingdom was the holder of the balance and relatively an hegemonic leader, in contrast to what Mearsheimer have told you a couple of months ago. So that we call is Pax Britannica. The post-World War II period we call Pax Americana, because it's the United States that sits at the very center of the economic system. One of the observable elements, okay, one of the things that you can look to assess which country is more powerful at any given period of time is to look at the central role that currencies play. In the Bretton Woods system, the American dollar is placed at the very core. Okay? The system is still intact. Okay? The American dollar is still currently the main currency in the world. Okay? It's now being challenged because there are other economic powers who claim that since the American economy is not doing so well in the past 10 years, but it still is the largest economy in the world, China is about to catch it up, then the dollar should not sit at the very center. But in the Bretton Woods structure, which is still intact, we still have the Bretton Woods system, in 1944, the American dollar is placed at the very center, gold is fixed to the American dollar, and international financial stability was linked to American financial stability. Okay? As long as the dollar remained strong, international financial order would be stable. Okay? And Bretton Woods basically created two organizations, two international institutions that is responsible for the management of the international economy and for the implementation of these rules, International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. Now, going back to my starting point, what happened in the 70s? Okay? In 1971, from 1944 to 1971, the American dollar carried this burden. Okay? It carried the fact that there would be some gold backing up the dollars that are printed, and it carried basically the responsibility for international financial order. But by the time you come to 1971, it became obvious that the fixed exchange rate with the gold standard linked to the American dollar could no longer function, okay? Could no longer continue functioning as such. So in 1971, the American president at the time, who do you think would be the American president in 1971? Nixon. Very good, Batuhan. Nixon claimed, well, the gold standard applies no more. So we actually see a unilateral, this is a single action without consulting the other countries in the Western liberal order. The American government unilaterally declared that the fixed exchange rate system could no longer continue because there is no more gold backing up the dollar. So we have a similar financial crisis in 1971, let's say, to what you guys are witnessing currently, okay? The minute a government says, you know, my currency is no longer fixed to the gold, it's a new source of information that changes, at least, you know, shakes up the international financial system. First, okay, it demonstrates that the American dollar is no longer as strong as it was in 1944, right? Or in the 1940s and the 50s. Part of this is, of course, the trade flows began to change in the late 60s. We see the rise of Far East Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, okay, as areas where industrial production booms and expands. Okay, there is an expansion of Japanese cars. Okay? The cars that you are familiar with today, Toyota, Honda, what have you, they were not, they were not very good cars in the 50s. So if you wanted to go and buy a car in the 50s and the 60s, you either bought American or a German car, okay? Not a Japanese one. But by the time you come to the end of the 60s, early 70s, Far East Asia, things that you are now taken for granted, began to expand, okay? They didn't have it before. So trade balances between the US, Europe, versus Far East Asian countries began to change. So the dynamic that you are currently living in, okay, the expansion of the Asian economy, okay, the emergence of China. In the 70s, China was a very poor rural country, but it's not today. The expansion of Far East Asia begins at the end of the 60s, early 70s, through first the leaders of Asian economic growth, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. Okay, 5. Hong Kong was part of UK then. Okay, so we actually see an alteration in the 70s, an alteration in the international economic order. So 3 factors. The gold standard is dismantled, 1971, by American unilateral action. The rise of Far East Asian economies began to challenge and to a large extent threaten the industrial production that is taking place in the US and in Europe. And third, by the time you come to 1973, the OPEC crisis, as Batuhan have said, demonstrated that the American and European economies, and also Japan, by the way, are highly dependent upon Middle Eastern resources. And if there is a disruption in the oil flow from the Middle East to the Western and industrialized world, let's say, it would shake up the both economic and political power situation. So empirically, what we see in early 70s, my voice is going, empirically what we see in the early 70s is, could be grouped as economic transformation, okay? A global economic transformation. The post-World War II economic pillars are shaken, and new challenges economically emerge. Okay, so what happens empirically, what happens on the ground, always has a scholarly response to that. Okay? People try to explain what is happening in early 70s. Okay? Do we have enough conceptual tools that realist paradigm provides us with that we can use to understand the transformation that is taking place or the new challenges that are taking place in the 70s? Okay? Is Japan, for example, threatening the United States politically? Okay? Is Japan threatening the United States in 1971, 1973, what have you, with respect to its military capabilities? Does it have the A-bomb? Okay? The answer is no. Okay? Empirically, there is no threat coming from these newly rising economies in the Far East Asia on the military capabilities of the dominant powers at the time, most specifically the United States. Okay? At the same time, okay, the US economy, which begins to go through this transformation as well, finds itself less and less powerful compared to the newly rising economies. Of course, it's not like what we have today. The United States was still the most powerful economy in the 1970s, but we still see the first glimpses into the global transformation. But at the same time, the global transformation that is taking place at the time is not what the realists predicted to be. Okay? The global challenges that realists would basically tell you would be important revolve around security concerns. Okay? So if Japan is challenging the US power, from a realist perspective, it has to be rather through, let's say, the military capabilities that Japan has. Exactly like the US and USSR balance of power. But we see a parallel development to the American and the Soviet balance of power in the 70s taking place in the economic realm. Okay? So we see the pop-up of a number of scholars who began to argue that, well, economics matter in international politics as much as security concerns. So there is a direct connection between what is happening on the ground empirically in the 70s with the scholarly response that comes from the academic world. Apparently, the nuclear capabilities, military capabilities, okay, things that you would, lump sum under security only constitutes one aspect of international politics and international relations, and there is another equally important group of factors that we need to take account, that we would need to take into account, which revolve around economic realm. Okay? So we have, in the early 70s, a new branch arising under the liberal paradigm, which is different than our domestic and foreign linkage aspect of liberalism, which looks at the system again, but this time the system it looks at is not relatively directly shaped by security concerns, but the international system through the economic balances, okay, through the economic factors. So we see the rise of what we call a separate realm under IR theory that's called IPE, International Political Economy, which you guys will have to take as one of your mass courses next semester, IR 391. Okay? So there is a direct connection to what is happening on the ground to what is taking place scholarly. So what does IPE study? Okay? What is it that we actually see under international political economy? And we actually have a number of key names in the IPE track. We have, for example, Robert Keohane. Okay? You're reading Keohane for this week and next week. We have Robert Gilpin. Okay? We have, to a certain extent, Joseph Nye, who basically introduces you to the idea of soft versus hard power. So what is it that IPE studies? So from an international political perspective, one of the things that you need to look at is the international distribution of political power is directly connected to the international economic interactions or international economic balances. What are the international economic balances that IPU looks at? The financial order and the trade system. Okay? And these, always keep in mind, are the main two pillars of international economics in the post-World War II period. Okay? So two main pillars of the international economic system: financial order, the trade rules. Okay? Financial order, Bretton Woods system; trade rules, the GATT agreement, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. Okay? And these are actually international regimes, which I will talk about on Tuesday, what an international regime is. And the IP scholars basically say that international economic dynamics are not only shaped by economic changes and economic factors, but there is a direct connection between what is taking place in the political dimension with respect to economics. So we have, in early 70s, a new glimpse into the world order, which takes the interaction between politics and economics as critical, okay? Similar to what we have been discussing before the second midterm, that domestic and foreign are interlinked, politics and economics are interlinked, is the IPE idea, okay? And you cannot understand international political dynamics, you cannot understand wars, you cannot understand the main concerns in a number of countries unless you can uncover the economic dynamics behind it. Is a very critical development. That's practically the reason why you have on the international studies program a combination of politics and economics together, because unless you can capture the economic dynamics, there is no way you can actually understand international political developments and international system at all, okay? And that's one of the weaknesses if you study political science without actually looking into economics and only take macro as the only economic course, you only have an inadequate or a partial glimpse into the world order, okay? And we see this in the 1970s with the rise of the emphasis on the research on international economic dynamics. Now, yet the realists also enter into this debate, okay? So the realists don't basically say economics don't matter, okay? And this is also very important. Economics do matter from a realist perspective, but economics matter as long as they boost the political power of a country. So the central debate, let's say, or a point of contention that emerges in IPE track between the realists and liberals revolve around the notion of cooperation. Two different barriers. One, what we call tariff barriers, which are monetary, they are taxes. These are things you're probably learning in macro. And second, through non-tariff barriers, the one that would matter the most at the moment for you is restrictions in quantity, okay? So the Turkish government would restrict the number of German cars that could enter the Turkish market, okay? Quotas, okay? You emphasize, you only allow a certain amount of products to enter Turkey, okay? So if every Turkish citizen is dying to drive a Porsche, they can't, okay? Even if they have the money, because the number of Porsche cars that are allowed to enter the Turkish market are limited by non-tariff barriers. So one of the things that Putin and Erdogan were discussing is this. If you want to increase the trade volume between Turkey and Russia, we could actually look into the existing barriers to trade between Turkey and Russia and reduce them, okay? Either decrease the taxes, you know, decrease the quota barriers, and boost cooperation, well, boost mutual agreements on multiple different areas, okay? So increase Turkish, Russian economic interactions, okay? And this again, as I have, you know, stressed and explained to you before, becomes one of the areas that states could actually force other states to act in a certain way, okay? You might remember a couple of years ago, a similar trade boost was adopted between Turkey and Syria, okay? So Turkey and Syria lifted a number of restrictions on economic flows. Turkey and Syria eliminated visa. So Turkish citizens entered Syria without visa. Syrian citizens entered Turkey without a visa, which in return led to intensified economic activity in the neighboring regions between Turkey and Syria, Diyarbakir, Gaziantep, Adana, Mersin, what have you, okay? And at the same time, there were increased foreign direct investment, okay? So these are tools, direct investment, visa, and trade. These emerge economic tools that states use to improve their relations with other states. So Russia and Turkey eliminated visas last year. That was one of the things that was decided in the Turkish visit to Russia. So when Putin came here, they were just discussing further expansion of the economic interactions, okay? Now, decreasing tariffs among two states, okay? If you have 100 units of, let's say, tariff, to decrease it to 50 is called international cooperation, okay? Both parties are harmonizing, adjusting their economic policies in relation with the other country. So when you change something, okay, in your, well, foreign or domestic policy, it really doesn't matter which one. When you change something as an adjustment to another state's actions, we call this international cooperation, okay? So you can actually have a very simple definition of international cooperation, harmonizing, okay? Harmonizing your actions vis-a-vis other states. You could harmonize your actions in economics. And the international cooperation is extensive. It could range from very mundane things like, I don't know, postal union, to very high political areas such as military missiles. Now, the realists and liberals differ with respect to how they emphasize international cooperation, especially with respect to trade-related matters, okay? Things that would go under trade-related issues. Well, let's actually discuss this for a second. What might motivate Russia and Turkey to cooperate? Why would Turkey and Russia agree on decreasing the trade barriers between them? And this will affect your life, basically, okay? This could also be one of the questions that Ali Can might have to answer when he is interviewing the foreign ministry, or one of the questions that Duygu will have to answer if she's trying to enter the United Nations, okay? What is it that Turkey and Russia have in common? What might be the main motivation for Putin to come to Turkey in the first place? He was sitting very happily in his palace in Kremlin. Moscow is warm and, you know. So why did he come to Istanbul? What might motivate a state leader to move from his comfortable lodgings, you know, travel to another country and have these very formal meetings with another state leader? Okay, so if you're a realist, you will say, very straightforward, states have common interests, okay? Convergence of interests. And this convergence of interest makes them cooperate, okay? Now, the convergence of interest is caused by what? What makes convergence of interests more likely? The presence of a common enemy is always an underlying cause for a convergence of interest. If you have a common enemy, it's more likely for you to cooperate. NATO, international cooperation, all NATO members feel threatened by Tolga, the bad guy, which is the Soviet Union. So they say, okay, if one of us is attacked, the other will come to its defense. Okay, so you have a common enemy. As long as he perceives there is a threat, he would form an alliance or some form of international cooperation with Ali Can based on the existence of a common threat. So Turkey and Israel in 1994 see the bad guy. Who is the bad guy in 1994 for Turkey and Israel? Is it Tolga? Who is the bad guy? Syria, precisely, very good. So the bad guy is Syria, it's Iraq, it's Iran. Okay? So Turkey and Israel in early 1990s feel threatened by the same group of countries, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. So Turkey and Israel think, okay, if you're encountering the same enemies, okay, we can increase our power vis-a-vis the same enemies by cooperating on multiple different areas. Intelligence sharing, military cooperation, education, what have you, okay? So what matters is this. From a realist perspective, cooperation is possible when there is a convergence of interests. This convergence of interests from a realist perspective is almost always security ridden, okay? But what causes convergence of interest, okay? It is questionable, okay? In the sense that one group of realists will exactly tell you what I have just told you. Convergence of interests are possible when there is a common threat perception, okay? The threat doesn't have to be real. So the presence of Syria, Iraq, and Iran as possible threats to Turkey and Israel cause them to come together, sign an agreement. So the presence of an hegemon, okay, the presence of an hegemonic leader could also, so if I tell Ali Can and Bora, you sit together and study for IR final together, no? I'm making them cooperate on a common area. I'm making them cooperate on studying for the final. If I say this, they will have to do it because I'm changing something about their cost-benefit calculations. So realists tell you that convergence of interests is always the cause of international cooperation, okay? But what causes that convergence of interests, okay? Is it the presence of a common enemy? Is it the presence of an hegemonic leader? They don't necessarily agree, but both tell you the same thing, okay? The presence of an hegemon, the United States, in the post-World War II period, Bretton Woods is an example of international cooperation, okay? States agree in 1945 that they will peg their currencies to the American dollar. And as long as American dollar remains the central currency, the French franc, the German mark, the British pound, what have you, will follow the American policies. Okay? That's the presence of an hegemon, changing the French, German, British, what have you, behavior with respect to their international financial order. So an hegemon changes the cost-benefit calculations for individual units. Okay? In our example, the hegemon Meltem changes Alican and Bora's cost calculations for studying for an exam. Tamam. For a Bretton Woods perspective, the presence of the United States, the hegemonic leader, changes the individual countries' cost-benefit calculations vis-a-vis the financial order. The presence of the US changes the country's cost-benefit calculations with respect to NATO. Okay? So one path to convergence of interests passes through the presence of an hegemon. The second path, or the second alternative, let's say, for a convergence of interests for international cooperation passes through TOLGA, okay, the common enemy. Okay?